Good evening. My name is Jeffrey Herbst, and I am president of American Jewish University in Los Angeles. I'd like to welcome the more than 400 people who have registered for this discussion of Iran and the United States, permanent enemies. This program is part of our new series, Bayachad Together, spirited by AJU. In response to the pandemic and worldwide economic crisis, American Jewish University has developed a dynamic series of free online programming. Throughout April and May, and for as long as the crisis lasts, please return to Bayachad Together, where you'll find programs that will inform, excite, and entertain you. American Jewish University seeks to elevate and advance the Jewish journey for people, organizations, and our community as a whole. We seek to meet the American Jewish population where it is in the 21st century. We educate rabbis, we train Jewish educators, and we prepare managers for nonprofit organizations to serve the community. We also have a wide variety of non-academic programs, including a much beloved summer camp, Camp Alanim, the Wizen Center for Continuing Education, which provides courses and lectures to a large number of people each year, and the Miller Introduction to Judaism program, which provides a wide variety of people, irrespective of denomination or background, with a pathway to greater Jewish understanding, and is in fact the largest pathway to conversion in the United States. Today, I'm delighted to welcome Sam Yebri and Omar Qudrat to this discussion of the United States and Iran. Sam is a Los Angeles-based lawyer who was co-founder of 30 Years After, an organization which has engaged, energized tens of thousands of Persian Americans, Iranian Americans into civic life and to provide them with a greater voice. Omar Qudrat was a JAG captain in Afghanistan, where he served for 18 months during the surge, and also made several subsequent visits to lead investigations of terrorists and to ensure that the rule of law was continued by the US military. We'll have a discussion for about 20 to 25 minutes, and then we'll open up to questions from you. I encourage you to use the Q&A function of this Zoom meeting to ask questions at about the 20-minute mark. I'll give you plenty of notice as to where we are. Again, I'd like to welcome you on behalf of American Jewish University to this most recent program in our Bayachad Together series, spirited by AJU. Sam, let me ask you first, we've heard a lot out of Iran recently regarding the prevalence of the virus, economic turmoil, and leadership rifts. What's your understanding of the current situation?
Well, first of all, Jeff, thank you for hosting this important webinar. It's a pleasure to be with you. In terms of the pandemic, the people of Iran have unfortunately been hit very hard by the COVID-19 pandemic, in large part due to the mishandling of the regime. By its own numbers, more than 3,000 Iranians have died and more than 47,000 have been infected, and the World Health Organization suggests that those real numbers may actually be several times higher. The Iranian regime was not just negligent in failing to act swiftly and by being ill-prepared. The regime at first tried to hide the outbreak and then willfully misrepresented the scope of it in order to hold mass rallies in commemoration of the Islamic Revolution, the anniversary of it, to maximize turnout in Iran's February elections, by refusing to close Islamic shrines, Shiite shrines throughout Iran, and by refusing to shut down flights between Iran and the Wuhan region for economic reasons. It's also worth noting that the Islamic Republic has politicized this pandemic. While the United States has offered humanitarian aid, the Islamic Republic has refused it from the United States and from other countries, and in fact advanced anti-Semitic and anti-American conspiracy theories claiming that the United States or Jews or Israel were somehow behind this pandemic.
Omar? What's your perspective?
First of all, thank you, President Herbst, for inviting me to join you in this really important discussion, and to American Jewish University for putting this together. It's an honor to be with you. Um, my understanding is the same. I think what I would highlight is the significance of the impact on the leadership as well. The bottom line is that the political posture, unfortunately, of the Iranian government, again, it's the Iranian people who are paying the price. The United States has been consistent in its position that we support the Iranian people, and that's number one. And that's something that I, want to ensure that we get across before we start talking about permanent enemies between, the question regarding America, the government, and Iran, the government. People to people, I think we all really feel for the Iranian people and we support them. The political posture is, again, very costly because you have the president of Iran stating that the U.S. sanctions framework has actually not impacted Iran's ability in a meaningful way to respond to the crisis internally. But at the same time, the government of Iran is requesting funds from the IMF. And so deception being sort of the watchword and a very consistent tool of the Iranian government essentially leads it to incoherent positions where the people are paying the price. There's an incoherent foreign policy that just does not align with the interests of the Iranian people. The response internally is really hard to tell. The great thing about technology is that we get information from all over the world without having to rely on governments and dictatorships that tend to want to rely on and control state media to get information out there. But again, the Iranian government shutting down the internet for up to 11 days recently of the Iranian people. If we believe, as I do, that information is a human right, knowledge is a human right, people around the world are trying to connect with human rights through technology to the extent that the Iranian people are able to meaningfully engage with others in the world through the internet and be able to provide perspective. We might be able to learn something. Until then, I think we're going to see a consistent trend of deception with the Iranian people unfortunately paying the price. And I do hope Iran does reconsider America's offer of assistance. It's a very proud government. It's stubborn. We saw this with the situation with Soleimani, which we could get to in a minute. But at the end of the day, the true colors of nations and leaders show in terms of how they take positions that are going to benefit themselves, their power, or their people.
One of the biggest disagreements amongst observers of Iran is how much of a division is there between, let's call it the religious leadership, the Ayatollahs, and the political leadership, the president. And different people posit different amounts of separation between the two, especially after the January assassination of General Soleimani. What's your view on especially the fortunes of democratic or more moderate forces in Iran? Omar, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, we're still in the post-Soleimani death era in terms of the government being fractured, being really injured, and really hit publicly. It was a shock to the world. It was certainly a shock to Tehran that the United States killed its top military commander that was in charge of all of its external operations outside of Iran's borders, and essentially the terror campaign that Iran has afflicted regions around the world with. After an event like that, a nation like Iran's, in terms of the government, is going to need to consolidate power. It's going to need to kind of unify, ensure that in that situation of insecurity and fragmentation, it's able to consolidate, regroup, and assert its control and power internally, domestically. The rifts between the government is there competition between the religious leaders and political leaders. It's human nature, of course. Again, it comes down to how public and how willing political leaders are going to be to express that publicly and what those consequences could be. One key thing that I would highlight is the kind of factors for potential change. And the original kind of revolutionaries of Iran, and the ones that tend to wield the most influence, that were part of the revolution in the 70s and sort of the roots of it, they're getting older, and it's this, really almost poetic irony that you have a movement that seemed to be a youth movement that is now, being challenged. And if you actually pay attention to the positions and the views of a huge segment of the population of youth in Iran, the competition of that original youth movement in the 70s, which now includes influencers that were part of that original movement, I think is kind of engaging in some tension with how it's going to handle not just a group of young people who are free thinking, but incredibly brave and expressing their views in spite of the danger and the hundreds of people that even the IRGC has killed in demonstrations, peaceful protesters.
Sam?
I actually want to build off of 2 points that Omar raised. Well, as a first point, as a preliminary matter, when we talk about Iran, it's important for us to distinguish between the people of Iran and the regime that governs those people. The 80 million plus Iranians are generally young. 2/3 of them are under the age of 30. They're generally pro-West. They're generally well-educated. So that's a really important distinction when we talk about Iran today. And then secondly, in terms of its leadership, there's that misperception, and I'm going to diverge a little bit from Omar. There's a misperception that Iran is either a real democracy because it holds ostensible elections, or that there is a battle, tug of war between moderates and hardliners over who makes decisions. In reality, the regime is and has always been a theocracy, a brutally suppressive one, currently under the control of Ayatollah Khamenei. With that said, while there are other forces and leaders, military, economic, and otherwise, all of them have one goal above all else at the end of the day, and that's survival of the regime. In terms of democratic forces, before this pandemic, the Iranian people were increasingly willing to risk their lives to stand up to the regime through various sustained and widespread protests. Most recently, November of last year, where Iranians of all backgrounds from throughout the country, really including religious ones as well, were not just criticizing the regime, but calling for change and questioning why their resources were being spent on foreign wars and terrorism. The question now, certainly that reached a crescendo after the Ukrainian airliner was shot down in January. Unfortunately, that momentum has been stunted by the COVID pandemic, and before that, the brutal suppression by the Iranian regime. I'm hopeful, though, that after conditions normalize and the Iranian people realize how this pandemic has been mishandled by its regime, the people will again stand up and protest against this regime.
Sam recounted some of the recent history of protests. There were, of course, very violently suppressed protests around the re-election of Ahmadinejad last decade, and flurries of protests and a lot of social media protests. But there's any way, given the state power in Iran, to actually get a feeling, a sense of what the popular views are, or are they just too suppressed at the moment for outsiders or the government itself to understand what the nominal will of the people is? I'll let either of you jump in.
I'll have to defer to Sam on this one. I haven't seen any polling or data that I would really feel that I could vouch for in terms of an accurate assessment of what the Iranian people's views are in a real scientific way. Obviously, this is a sort of thing that dictatorships and brutal regimes try to protect. I don't know if Pew is going to be out there doing opinion surveys anytime and actually being able to report to the rest of the world that some massive percentage of the people are against the regime. So for me, technology, I'm emphasizing technology again, to the extent that we were able to get at what you're getting after, President Herbst, which is what is the truth? What are the opinions and views of the Iranian people? That's an empirical question in terms of what they actually think. And the best chance we have is to be able to let people around the world be able to connect with their human right to information, but also expression. We could learn what we can and glean from technology. But I personally, I don't know if Sam is, but I'm unaware of and haven't seen any polling data at the national level that I could really rely on.
So the technology is key. With such a young population, social media and some of the messaging apps are fertile grounds for information, except for those 11 days in November when the regime shut down the internet throughout the entire country of Iran. On a daily basis, we're able to get reports, videos, information from Iran. The Iranian people are very active on social media, and the change more recently has been from some economic criticisms in terms of what happened to subsidies that the government has had to cut, or what happened to the benefits of the JCPOA that were promised, the Iran deal, to really now systemic questions of this regime and its future and what happened to this great Iranian culture and nation. And as a result of what's happening, you see the Iranian regime slightly changing its behavior. It's had to, both because of the unrest, but also economic pressures, the Iranian regime has had to cut its financial support of Hezbollah, who continues to ask for more and more money from Iran, as well as Iran's support of Shiite militias in Iraq. So the unrest is having some impact, coupled with the economic pressure. But more than anything else, it's not a question of the moderates having more influence. It's really these external and internal forces within Iran forcing some modest change from the in terms of behavior by the regime.
This is Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University. As part of our Bayahad Together, Spirited by AJU series, I'm delighted to be talking with Sam Yebri and Omar Qudrat about U.S.-Iranian affairs. One of the most important issues for the United States, of course, is Iran's behavior in the region, whether it's in Yemen, attacks on Saudi Arabia, destabilization, Bahrain and other countries, very active involvement, of course, in Syria and Lebanon. Do you see any forces, either internal or external, that'll change its regional stance in the near future? Or do you think that the role that Iran's played over the last many years now as this kind of spoiler and disruptor will continue?
I'll just build off of what I said a second ago. The unrests have shown the Iranian people are laser focused on questioning why the resources of the Iranian people are being spent in Lebanon, Syria, Iraq, Yemen, Gaza, and there's more of a focus on that. I think that's having an influence, and then coupled with the economic realities within Iran, with oil prices going under $30 per barrel, the President Trump's maximum pressure campaign in terms of economic sanctions bearing down on the economy has forced Iran to make hard choices. And like I said earlier, more than anything else, it cares about its survival. And there's been some change in its behavior in terms of support of Hezbollah and Iraqi militias and elsewhere. It has not been able to be as proactive as it has in recent history.
Omar?
So, you know, when raising regional activities, I think it implicates what is the global policy of Iran. I think that's inextricably linked in terms of answering that question. And then the ability for Iran to carry out that policy, which, you know, can be defined as the combination of its capabilities and its will. And then finally, what are our interests in that? The way I would place Iran in context globally, which I think is really important when discussing the regional activities. Iran is one of four revolutionary powers. As General Petraeus, who I had the honor of serving under at ISAF in Afghanistan as actually a civilian official at the time. I was not I'm a reserve officer in the U.S. Army. I was a Department of Defense civilian official at the time in Afghanistan during the surge. But four revolutionary powers, China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea. My understanding of Iran being a revolutionary power, which I agree with General Petraeus on, I'm going to give my definition of what that is with those four revolutionary powers. And it's essentially, I think the simple way to understand it is fundamentally challenging post-World War II order. Should we have any international norms? Do war crimes exist or not exist? And if you want to see Iran in action, or revolutionary powers like Russia and Iran in action, you can look at Syria. They have boots on the ground there. You have hundreds of thousands of civilians who have been murdered. There's ample evidence of war crimes. What direction is the world going to go in? there's a global competition right now, I think, where dictators are challenging democracies, and the direction of the globe is fully in competition between revolutionary powers where the rules of the road are being rewritten by these revolutionary powers. War crimes should not mean anything. International law in terms of freedom of navigation of the seas should not mean anything. Nation state on nation state wars seem to be a thing of the past. It's about asymmetric warfare. It's about cyber operations. It's about terrorism. And to zero in on regional activities, people tend to kind of zero in on the terrorism. And terrorism is an asymmetric means of carrying out warfare. You can have a $25 IED, improvised explosive device, that takes out a $1 to $2 million piece of equipment, a piece of American equipment. Terrorism does not cost the same as a nation waging conventional war. And so the command and control of the Iranian government, specifically the IRGC, is very effective, and they're able to wield influence throughout the world. The regional activities are not just in the Middle East. In 2007, the Venezuelan head of state and Iran characterized their relationship as the axis of unity. Iran, as you know, is very active as an OPEC nation and trying to influence the cost of oil in coordination with its allies, influencing Venezuela, trying to expand its influence in the Western Hemisphere, introducing Hezbollah operatives in Venezuela. Here in our neighborhood, you have Hezbollah operatives getting arrested in the United States. The terrorism is part of it. I think one big question is, how is the United States going to effectively address all of our interests and meshed with Iran? It's terrorism, it's the ICBM program, it's the nuclear capability. This administration tends to want to deal with all of those things together as linked, whereas the previous administration and what looks like nominee Biden has already stated he would rejoin the JCPOA. The GDP of Iran grew over 10% with the JCPOA, the sanctions in 2018. And then now have caused Iran's growth to go down. And I'll just kind of stop here. The regional activities, I think the big question that's being asked around the world is, when are the sanctions going to actually reduce the intensity of the terrorist campaign that Iran has all over the world? And it's a really tough question. Part of it is psychological. If Iran can wait this out, if Iran thinks that Joe Biden might get elected, and I'm not trying to get partisan here, but Joe Biden has stated that he would rejoin the JCPOA. And if there's a sense that you can wait just a little longer, it's going to shape the contours of the behavior and decision-making of leadership. Whereas if President Trump's maximum pressure, of course, inevitably, there's a resource constraint. The foreign adventurers have to contract at some point. It's just a matter of how long can the United States implement a consistent policy while we have a democracy with changes of administration.
Sam, I want to get your opinion on U.S. policy under both Presidents Obama and Trump. But let me first tell the audience that after this question, I'm going to be looking at the Q&A channel. So please formulate and get ready your questions, which you can submit through the Q&A channel of Zoom. Sam, one of the interesting things about the last two administrations is that there have been two presidents who have both been very focused on Iran, both of whom had whole government strategies or wanted to have whole government strategies, albeit, as Omar said, drawing very different conclusions about the role of pressure and incentives and the like. What's your feeling now, 3 years in or so, of the Trump administration's maximum pressure policy compared to President Obama's stance?
Sure. So critics of President Trump's maximum pressure policy predicted that it would either lead to war or lead to Europeans and the Chinese and the Russians disregarding the American economic system and doing massive business with Iran. The supporters of the president promised that leaving the JCPOA, the Iranian deal in 2015, and increasing sanctions would force Iran to come back to the negotiating table because they'd be forced to come back hand in hand to renegotiate. So neither of those two things has happened. The Iranian regime has taken drastic steps to maintain its own survival, to withstand this pressure. They've cut government subsidies. and taking other drastic steps as well, including some of its spending. In terms of the Trump administration, it on one hand is imposing added pressure, but is also taking a pragmatic approach. Recently, it added aggressive new targeted sanctions just 2 weeks ago. Yet 2 days ago, Tuesday of this week, the United States renewed waivers on Iran sanctions to allow international companies to conduct work at Iranian nuclear sites past the March 31st deadline for another 60 days. This clearly allowed breathing room for the pandemic, but also for the parties not to rush towards any conflict. Time will tell whether Trump's pressure is going to have a meaningful impact, or like Omar is saying, the Iran regime, which will just wait out this administration to see if they can get a more favorable one next time. Fundamentally, one of the challenges of the JCPOA, or its flaws, and that of President Obama's approach, was that it sunsetted. After 5 years, which would be this October, some of the restrictions on, for example, ICBM, ballistic missiles, and testing goes away. Some other restrictions go away after 8 years in 2023, and then the bulk of the restrictions expire in 2025. So the Iranian government has always taken the wait and see long-term approach, and and especially now under the pandemic, they're going to use time to their advantage and seek international sympathy.
Again, this is Jeffrey Herbst, president of American Jewish University. You're watching a discussion of U.S.-Iranian relationship as part of our Biyachad Together series. Delighted now to go to questions from our audience. A lot of questions coming in. We obviously won't get to even a significant percentage, but please keep sending them in. And let me ask you a question that's posed, and it may require speculation on your part. How is the COVID-19 crisis in Iran changing the attitude of the population towards the theocracy and the handling of the crisis? You obviously are a keen observer and you have close ties to the diaspora. Are there things we can say, even at this early stage, about how this worldwide pandemic and global crisis might affect Iranian attitudes?
I think what Omar said earlier is really important, that this regime is a deceptive, mendacious one. And the way that it handled this pandemic showed that. They hid it and then lied about it, allowing it to worsen, chose its economic relationships with China over the well-being of its people, refused to do anything to weaken its so-called elections or its anniversary of the revolution and things like that. I think we're not able to see protest or the anger publicly at this time, but I think it's really fermenting. It's certainly in the diaspora, as a proud Iranian American, we're outraged that the regime didn't do the right thing and protect its people and put politics and ideology behind. In fact, they're trying to use this pandemic and this health crisis to ease sanctions. They've called what the United States is doing in terms of continuing sanctions medical terrorism. And if anyone who knows this regime, the only one who's engaging in terrorism is the Iranian regime towards its own people and to innocent people in the Middle East.
Omar, thoughts on how the pandemic might affect Iranian attitudes?
So again, absolutely distinguishing between the government and the people. The people have access to information. They know their government is lying. This is a very, it's not only just a well-educated, but I think naturally incredibly brilliant population of people. It's not going to be, they just can't hide that they're lying. And so I think that the Iranian people, I mean, if just by inference, of course, I'm not there on the ground, but I would imagine would grow resentful, more resentful of a government when you have lives that are on the line and there's just outright deception taking place. And you have organizations like the World Health Organization, which I think got some dings on their credibility already, but even they are calling out Iran for using deception in terms of being accurate and the information they're releasing to the world. I don't see any evidence of Iran changing its global policy. And if it is, I don't think that it's going to broadcast that. Iran has kind of had the government has had a consistent kind of double down approach whenever it's faced with confrontation, and relies on and hopes that the United States is simply not going to engage in all-out warfare. It's just relying on the posture and policy position of the United States. It's not a secret that President Trump is against wars in the Middle East or in Muslim countries. There's a little bit of taking advantage of that. Ultimately, the asymmetric warfare, I think, is going to persist. I think it's going to continue. Iran has it's a patient government. It's cunning. It's actually quite brilliant in its tactical approach to how it deals with its global policy in the world. It has somehow been in conflict with the United States for some time, but at the same time stayed out of the jaws of the United States in a real, meaningful nation-on-nation warfare kind of way. But at the end of the day, I think, again, going back to the elections, the U.S. elections are so important. I mean, the way the rest of the world decides to behave is totally based on how it's going to perceive what the United States is going to do about it. How far is the United States willing to go? And the terrorism, you have terrorism that either increases or reduces based on the posture of the United States and what the calculations are from Tehran in terms of what the United States will or won't do. There's no evidence that the United States is now willing to get into wars in the Middle East or in Muslim countries. I haven't heard a policy change from DC. I haven't heard a policy change from Tehran. Ultimately, what I hope is that the sanctions are able to be given some time. A friend of mine and a mentor, you might remember Congressman Ed Royce, former chairman of the House Foreign Affairs Committee. You know, he said he was the author of some of the most aggressive sanctions frameworks against Iran. And what he said was, we had Iran against ropes. We had them down for the count. And then, you know, the JCPOA came in and kind of, you know, not only picked them up, but, you know, you give billions of dollars of cash to the most effective state sponsor of terrorism while they're killing Americans in a consistent way. You know, the logic for me is just not there, especially when you have a deal that you cannot really verify the performance of or the commitments being verified. So unfortunately, I think, you know, COVID is going to cost the Iranian people a great deal. And I think that the Iranian government is going to persist in its terrorism and asymmetric warfare.
Omar, thank you for that. Another question, how do the Iranian people themselves, not the government, generally feel about Israel and the Jewish people? Are they in agreement with the government or for the most part disagree? Sam, do you want to start?
Or I think, as I mentioned earlier, the Iranian people, on balance, obviously there are some elements, but on balance are pro-West, don't view Israel as a threat. Israel's never threatened the Iranian people. There's no Israeli has arrested a dissident or killed a family member like the regime has. And the Iranian people aren't going hungry because of what Israel's doing. So on balance, the Iranian people would welcome normalization in some regard with the Israeli people, which is similar to what's happening in the Sunni world. I think if the Iranian people were able to democratically express its will, you'd see a warming of tides similar to what was happening, what's happening throughout the Sunni Arab world.
Omar?
Yeah, I mean, I can comment perhaps on the regional activity. I'm not Jewish myself. I'm an American Muslim, but you know, the Syrian conflict is so important. The fact that you have Iranian boots on the ground so close to Israel, I would imagine would be a red line for Israel. Israel obviously wants Iran out of Syria. They want Iranian military and covert operatives out of the area. They're, you know, obviously very close to the Golan Heights. Iran has expressed an interest in having permanent munitions capabilities being permanently placed in the area, which is very close to Israel. Russia, from what I understand, Israel has obviously asked Russia, which, you know, some may perceive as the landlord of the Middle East now, to ask Iran to pull back because Russia is perceived to have great influence over Iran, and I believe that they do. And Russia has taken the official position that we can't really control what Iran does. And so for the time being, I see more instability the closer you have the Iranian military and trying to put permanent capabilities in a proximity that threatens Israel. we're going to see more instability, not greater peace. We're not going to see, I think, an increase in the trajectory of the relations warming. So what I would strongly emphasize is the Iranian government understands that. The Iranian government understands the consequences of how it threatens a nation like Israel. It understands how the United States would respond in defense of its ally. And so this is a very sensitive topic. Iran should really reconsider its presence in Syria and how it wants to behave toward Israel.
And Jeff, if I can just add one point.
Please.
The last 40 years, Iran and Israel have been enemies. But if you draw back a little bit before that, Israel and Iran had ties, economic ties, diplomatic ties. There were direct flights between Ben Gurion and Tehran. And although for the last 40 years, young Iranians have been force-fed propaganda, the fact that they have access to technology and can actually see for themselves what Israel is, and while they're stoning gay people in Iran, there's robust LGBTQ rights in Israel. Why there's no democracy that's meaningful in Iran, there's a robust, arguably too robust democracy in Israel. And I think the Iranian people, those who remember ties before this regime during the Shah, know better. And I see young people who have access to technology can see the truth as well.
Jeff Herbst, president of American Jewish University, as part of our ongoing online programming by Ahad Together, discussing with Sam Yebri and Omar Qudrat about U.S.-Iranian relations. And we have an audience of several hundred, which I'm grateful for you tuning in, and thank you for your questions, and we're trying to get to as many as possible. What would be the ramifications, Sam and Omar, if Iran came to possess one or more nuclear weapons, do you think?
Go ahead, Sam.
Well, I think it's been the policy of the United States, both under President Obama and President Trump, to prevent that, as well as the policy of Israel potentially as well. So I hope we never get there. And I think that Iran has at first flouted the spirit of the JCPOA and now having effectively left it and enriching uranium and spinning centrifuges in violation of it. There's evidence that they're marching towards that. I think it would be a game changer. I think it would give Iran, similar to North Korea, the ability to dictate its terms internationally. I think it would allow them to have free reign in the region and in terms of terrorism, and frankly within Iran, terrorism and suppression of its own people. I hate to speculate what it would lead to, but I do think that it must remain a bipartisan policy of our country to prevent that. And Omar mentioned Congressman and House Foreign Affairs Chairman Ed Royce authoring Iran sanction legislation. It's important to note that before he was chairman, it was Congressman Howard Berman who was the author on a bipartisan matter, almost in unanimous fashion, the landmark 2010 legislation on Iran sanctions, which was signed by President Obama. So it was a bipartisan position in the United States to prevent that. I am worried now that with everything else becoming partisan, we're losing that bipartisan consensus on this vital foreign policy challenge.
We can never accept a nuclear Iran, period. It's just not something that we can ever let become a reality. So the speculation of what could happen, Iran is known for extortion, global extortion, political extortion. It's also known for not really being the most disciplined or responsible country in the world, and that's an understatement. I mean, look at the tensions in Iraq between the United States and Iran as an example. There was no specific and imminent threat to the Iranian homeland by the U.S. government. There were some tensions that escalated. We did kill Soleimani, and then Iran became so tense and so nervous that they shot down a civilian airplane and killed hundreds of people. This is not a responsible nation. This is a nation that was so nervous and irresponsible and undisciplined and untrained on the trigger that it killed hundreds of civilians when the United States and Iran had a temporary escalation in tensions in another country, Iraq. So now you want to potentially have a world with Iran, and I don't mean you, I mean, the Iranian government wants to have nuclear capability and ICBM capability. Absolutely not. We should, I think all options have to be on the table. I do think that it is bipartisan. It's clear that both parties in the United States are against a nuclear Iran. What our disagreement is, I think, in the United States is the best way to get there. And obviously both parties have a different stance in terms of the best way to get there. But we cannot even speculate. Iran is a totally irresponsible nation. It would completely change the global dynamics for Iran to play extortion, just like they're doing right now, trying to get France is extending $15 billion to Iran simply to get them to come back to the table to even talk about the JCPOA. The extortion with nuclear capability would be on a whole different scale. It's just something that we cannot accept. And I do hope that there is a bipartisan position that remains consistent, and the United States is willing to engage in all means necessary to prevent a nuclear Iran.
One of the questions that's come through went to the point that you've both made about distinguishing between the government and the people. And the question, which I'll summarize, acknowledges that, but says, we see a lot of people yelling death to America, death to Israel. We saw massive outpourings after General Soleimani was assassinated. And can you, and of course the Revolutionary Guard is made up of almost entirely young people who were born after the revolution. Can we overdo the distinction between the Iranian people and the government?
I think that's a great question. If you don't mind, Sam, I'll make my answer quick. That's absolutely a valid question. That's a real concern. Of course, I mean, what I would offer is that people have diversity of opinion everywhere in the world. Iranians are no exception. So should we be concerned that there are Iranians in large numbers that are going to oppose the United States, chant death to America, death to Israel? And I think we should take them at their word. I do think that the Iranian people, to a large extent, are people who are concerned with the education and well-being of their families and their children, trying to make sure their families stay healthy and alive right now. Do I have any empirical data to be able to tell you how many Iranians actually do want all Americans dead and all Jewish people dead and so forth? No, I don't. But what I would do is acknowledge here that that is an absolutely valid concern. That you can actually overdo and maybe overplay that distinction. There are supporters of the regime. We do have partners on the ground, though. And what we have to understand, though, is if we want regime change, that's going to require partners on the ground. To be dismissive of a population based on footage of thousands who are chanting death to America, death to Israel, we have to kind of think a little bit deeper and then kind of longer, medium term, long term about knowing and recognizing that we're going to need partners there once there is regime change.
Sam, this will be the last word.
Sure. In a country of 80 million people, the vast majority of whom are young, having several thousand or tens of thousands march in support of the regime doesn't show widespread support. I think a better measure is what happened in November of 2019, where hundreds of thousands of Iranians, arguably millions, there's no adequate data, from every walk of life, from every corner of that country were protesting, some about economic issues, others about social issues, others about the regime itself. And we have to remember that this regime and its revolutionary guards and its different militias and its different elements control approximately 75% of this economy. There's people who live on the payroll and depend on the regime. And meanwhile, thousands of Iranians who do dare to speak up every year go missing or worse. And we have to have hope that this people who before 1979 had strong ties, warm ties in the United States and with Israel and the world, that the Iranian people will want to return to at least becoming a normal nation again. And that's when the policy of both President Trump and President Obama is to force Iran to act like a normal country. The analogy that's been used is just be like a Norway. No terrorism, no murdering your own people, no funding wars, no killing Americans, no denial of the Holocaust or threatening to wipe Israel off the map. And that really is the goal that the entire international community should join together to try to figure out how to accomplish. And it's going to be done, like Omar said, by the Iranian people. And the hope is we need to find the right ways to lift those voices and bring a democratic, normal Iran back to the international stage.
Sam, Omar, thank you so very much for this discussion. Obviously, we could go on for much longer, but time has now elapsed. I'd like to also thank the audience. American Jewish University is sponsoring the online free series, Bayachad Together, spirited by AJU. Please go to our webpage, aju.edu, and you'll see that we have designed a wide variety of online programming that will inform, entertain you for the weeks to come. And we hope after this crisis that we will continue to provide high quality programming and education to the community at large. In the meantime, it's all our wishes that you and your family be safe and healthy. Thank you so very much.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.